I was trying to test my sister a couple days after this happened to see if she remembered anything. And I said the man with the I think it was a watch, with the watch, and I said something about him to her, and she's like, "What are you talking about?" But she said it in a way, now looking back, that I think she was lying to me, because like I said, she was an evil little kid in a lot of ways. And she didn't like me, and she was there to see me suffer. So she was playing along with it too, I think. I think she wouldn't give me anything to hold on to. It's like you're on your own kind of thing, is the impression that I was getting from her. I knew that in my core. I second guessed my own intuition around what I saw with her. And so I always was like, I don't know if she's really, if she remembers or not. But now I know. I think she doesn't remember it now. Like, I think she conveniently blocked it out of her own mind, but I think at the time, I think she knew what was going on. And my guides have said that to me all along, and have been very adamant about that, especially more recently, that she knew what was going on, and she also, just let it happen. So anyway, my mom, it was like there was zero memory of any of it. I never heard another word from her about any of that, any of the bloody sheets, any of it. And so eventually I kind of pulled myself out of the depression, like a few days later. It actually did give me newfound hope almost, or a reason to live, because I was like, this is so fucked up. I was like, I'm gonna expose all of these motherfuckers, because then I knew it wasn't just Rick. I knew there were other people that were doing these things, but I didn't know the extent of it at that point. So what I was gonna say before was that when I was younger, because like my understanding, my intuitive understanding about the situation is that they weren't sure that they had gotten the right soul when they snatched me. After I was born into this body, this incarnation, they did a lot of like random tests and stuff on me, and usually it was where I had to use my intuition. They would hold their hands behind their back, and they would hold up like a certain number of fingers, and they would ask me, how many fingers am I holding up? Now, every time that one of those things happened, and I'll say that in a second. So every time that happened, my guides told me to lie. They were like, lie, don't let them know that you know. And so I would. So I knew the answer. Like one time it was 7, and they were like, how many fingers am I holding up? And I heard very clearly my guides say lie. And I said, okay, 3. And they were like, nope, it's 7. And they showed me, and I was like, I knew that shit. And I got every single, like every time they were asking me something like that, I got it right. But I had to lie. My guides were always like, they're going to kill you, or it's going to be worse for you and it was either killing or worse for me, because I don't think my guides knew for sure what they were going to do if they knew that they had gotten the right person, the right soul. But I mean, I was in a horrific situation regardless, but I think it would have been even worse, or they would have potentially physically tortured me more than they did if they had known all of that. The other thing, so in my other podcast, I had mentioned Dr. George, who was a spiritual guru. He had started a church that was an offshoot of the Paramahansa Yogananda Self-Realization Fellowship organization. So this church was under that banner, basically, and Dr. George was a holy man. He was an enlightened master that knew my parents, that had actually sought out my parents intentionally to try to help me. I know that now. I know that I only learned that very recently. So he had started this church, and Rick was an ordained minister. Rick's family had a history in, I think it was a Zionist churches. I don't know much about it. I was not raised Zionist, and I wasn't raised in a church in that sense. Like I went to this church very infrequently, the one that Dr. George started, and Rick had taken over as minister when I was very young, which I'll get into more of why that was such a sick thing for him to do. But he did. And I remember some of these tests were happening at the church. And I remember arguments of the adults in the church, and this was long after Dr. George had passed away. There was arguments in the church between Rick and other people that were in the church. And I didn't quite understand what was happening. And I don't understand fully why there were arguments around it and why there were other people in the church who were wanting to test me. My guess is that because my parents were portraying themselves as these very spiritual, high vibe people, very awake and woke and aware. There was no woke at that point, but aware, and they were portraying themselves as spiritual teachers who were helping people. And he was the head of Dr. George's church, which Dr. George's church was considered sacred by the people who had known Dr. George. And so having Rick take over, I think there was a lot of people that didn't want him to, because I think a lot of people did not like his energy in the church. There were a lot of people who liked his energy outside of the church, but because he had a very powerful aura and powerful energy, and he was a leader in so many different organizations, and he held power in his community, they had a hard time getting him out of that position. But my sort of peripheral understanding of the situation was that my parents were trying to say that I was like a spiritual, they had birthed this spiritual child, which I think is really funny because they were holding me captive for that reason. But yet they were using it as look at me, I'm special, to these other people. Well, I think these other people wanted to test me, because I remember it wasn't only my father and mother that were, my mom never really did it, but Rick was, and other men in the organizations would test me on things. But it was for different reasons. This church situation, I think that the people in the church were testing me because they were like, you're full of shit kind of thing to Rick. The people that didn't like him, which there wasn't very many of them. And because I lied, they were like, see, she's nothing special. Even though what's such a stupid thing, but what an ego thing to even begin with. What an ego trip. And then they, were like, you're phony or whatever, but there were still a lot of people that believed him. It's interesting because as I'm saying this, my understanding of the situation deepened, and it's just interesting. I asked Spirit to kind of work through me through these videos. And anyway, it's just a side note. The reason why the men, Rick and the men in the men's organization were testing me is because I started asking too many questions, and they were doing different types of testing. They wanted to see my intuition again, or they wanted to test my mental capacity. I was always very smart, and I was in the gifted and talented classes in school. And I remember something happened and my mom pulled me out of the classes. I think they actually took me somewhere outside of school one time. And I remember my mom having it out with one of the administrators of the school and being like, why, you didn't tell us this was happening, whatever. And she made them pull me out of the gifted and talented classes. I remember that. Anyway, that's a side note. But the people who are in the disclosure realm know what I'm talking about, because a lot of the gifted and talented classes, they take children and they do different things, the military and the government, and some extraterrestrial races are involved in it, and they do different things with children that they find to be very proficient in a certain thing like math. And there's a lot of mind control. Okay, I'm getting off track, but it is so I will get a little bit into that in a separate video, but the people that are into the disclosure movement will know what I'm talking about, because it's known that they're basically trafficking those children, but they're putting them to work. They're doing different military operations, like using their spiritual abilities or things like that. They end up being put into some of the agencies at a young age. Like, they keep an eye on them, they keep tabs on them. Looking back, I don't think my mom, it's funny that my mom would actually, because like every once in a while she would do something that's like defending her child, that was actually something right, that was like defending me or protecting me from something legitimate. There were times where she did that, but it's like the worst of the worst was happening in your own household, you crazy. Okay, I think I'm going to end the episode here. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.